Tipping has become a burden. 25, 50, 75% tips for a takeout order or Starbucks coffee. And don't even get me started on food delivery apps. If you're ordering something small, be prepared to leave a tip that's worth more than your order itself. And it's not just restaurants where you'll be tipping either. Nowadays, tipping is commonplace at barbershops, car washes, Ubers, plumbers, and basically any other service that you
Literally
can
everywhere.
think of, which doesn't really make sense. At least with restaurants.
Yeah. For restaurants, at least you're paying for the service, right? Nothing better than a fresh Coca-Cola at 10 in the morning, right?
The service is not the main thing you're paying for. You're paying for the food. So it kind of makes sense to appreciate great service that came along with it. But in the case of a car wash or a haircut, you're paying.
Wait.
At least with restaurants, the service is not the main thing you're paying for. You're paying for the food. So it kind of makes sense to appreciate great service that came along with it. But in the case of a car wash or a haircut, you're paying for the service itself. So it's kind of odd that you have to pay 15 or 25% more. And inflation
kinda
has
odd.
only made this worse. Now, I'm not trying to
No,
suggest that these
my
people
fork
shouldn't be
went into
paid a
my
fair wage, but rather that it should be
Yolk.
reflected in the upfront
Fuck.
price. This would not only make it easier for customers to gauge just how much they're spending for a service, but it also makes the income of the service worker much more stable. In fact, this is how it's done in most places outside of the United
Wait, what? I missed it?
more. And inflation has only made this worse. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that these people shouldn't be paid a fair wage, but rather that it should be reflected in the upfront price. This would not only make it easier for customers to gauge just how much they're spending for a service, but it also makes the income of the service worker much more stable. In fact, this is how it's done in most places outside of the United States and Canada. In countries like France, Denmark, and much of Europe, a standard service fee of 15% is applied to all bills. So there is no awkward
That makes sense.
situation where you have to select 15,
That seems like such a better way to do things.
25, 35%, or no tip as the cashiers watch you. But even this is not ideal. Ideally, the price of the service is just included in the product itself, as is the case in Japan, China, and South Korea. In fact, in many of these countries, tipping is actually considered rude and disrespectful. The reason being that if you're tipping, you're basically insinuating that the business does not pay them enough, which is unfortunately often the case in America. In fact, the minimum wage for service workers is only $2.13 per hour in America.
Wait, what? There's no way that's right. That's wait. As long as you make at least I don't think there's a single business out there that does that. There's no shot that there's a business that does that. Really, that is the scummiest thing I've ever seen in my life, dude. There's no shot. I refuse to believe that.
But how did things get so bad? How did tipping go from being something that we use to appreciate exceptional service to being a burden for customers and a necessity for employees? Taking a look back, tipping wasn't always a custom in the United States, but it has been this way for quite some time, as American
there's Big
tipping
Dawes.
dates back to
Hey, that was Big
States.
Dawes.
But it
I love this guy. I love his channel.
has been this way for quite some
That's sick.
time, as American tipping dates back to the mid-1800s. You may have heard that tip stands for to ensure promptness, but that's just a myth. In reality,
To ensure
tipping was something
promptness?
that wealthy Americans discovered when traveling to Europe. You see, tipping was a master serf custom that was invented in Europe during the Middle Ages. Masters would reward servants with extra cash for excellent service. As these Americans saw this practice, they latched onto it and they brought it back to the US. Being able to pay extra for a service really showcased their status and wealth, which many of their egos could not resist. But tipping didn't catch on in America that easily. In fact, there was a lot of resistance to tipping. For one, people felt that tipping culture was simply reinforcing social constructs and classism. The upper class was literally flexing their wealth on lower class citizens. But that wasn't the only concern. The other concern was that tipping was only viable for the rich. Eating out was expensive as it is, so expecting middle class and lower class people to offer tips on top of the bill seemed un-American. Fun fact, this ideology became so prevalent in America that it actually spread to Europe, and that's why tipping is not standard in European countries. But America would completely U-turn on this idea after the Civil War. While slaves were finally freed, their job prospects weren't all that great, and most of them would end up in service-related industries.
Okay. So this is... I see. Oh, I didn't mean to actually click forward. Fuck.
In service-related industries. And these industries figured that this was the perfect opportunity to capitalize on tipping. You see, these industries figured that they could get away with paying former slaves no money. Technically, they weren't enslaving these people as they could earn money through tips. Also, they could theoretically leave at any time, but really, it's not like they had anywhere else to go.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, they're gonna leave this one job where they're, finally actually making money to go out at a chance to find another place? Like, that's just not gonna happen, right?
Go to. So, service industries became filled with former slaves that became dependent on tips for income. Suddenly, tipping was no longer a way to flex your wealth. It became much more of a moral issue. If you didn't tip, you were inadvertently supporting slavery. Now, of course, you could argue that if
They
you buy
flipped
chocolate
that?
or something,
Can't believe they flipped that like that. That's egregious.
you're supporting child labor in some third world country. But it's much harder to accept that when you're face to face with a person. Essentially, people who were against slavery started feeling obliged to tip, regardless of their own financial position, and with that, tipping started becoming a burden. While tipping was rapidly gaining popularity throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, this isn't to say that everyone was happy with the practice. In fact, a large portion of the population was not happy with the practice, and we would see some resistance.
Why did you spell practice with a fucking V? Like I
Be
wasn't
with the
gonna notice
practice.
that.
In fact,
With the practive?
a large portion
Was not happy with the practive? Really? You fucking spelled it with a V, you bozo?
of the population was not happy with the practice, and we would see some resistance even from local governments. Georgia, for example, deemed that tips were essentially commercial bribes used to influence service. So naturally, paying bribes should not be customary or encouraged. But the issue was that much of the pushback from these governments were
Wow, that's actually like... It is almost like a bribe to, like, get better service, huh? That's crazy. That's actually crazy.
classic in their own ways. For example, in 1915, 6 states would abolish the practice of tipping. This seems like a reasonable move. The policy that should have been introduced to enforce this rule would have been some sort of minimum wage. This way, service workers would no longer be dependent on tips. But instead of punishing businesses for paying $0 incomes, these governments would decide to punish service workers. Iowa, for example, ruled that those who accepted a gratuity of any kind, not those who gave the money themselves, could be fined or imprisoned.
Imprisoned? Really? For
Fortunately,
accepting money?
Supreme Courts
That's
would step
fucking ridiculous, bro. For accepting money? Really?
in and deemed these rules unconstitutional.
Good.
But they never
Jesus.
proposed a better
That's
solution,
egregious, bro.
meaning that things just returned to how they were. In fact, they actually became worse due to a series of laws passed by Congress, starting with the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This legislation introduced a federal minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and banned child labor, which sounds great. But the pitfall of this act was that it specifically excluded tipped workers. Congress would simply double down on this stance in 1966 with their so-called tip credit. Essentially, restaurants were legally allowed to pay a sub-minimum wage as long as tips pushed workers over the minimum wage threshold.
This has changed, right?
At least restaurants were required to pay a percentage of the minimum
There's
wage,
no way that
usually
that's
somewhere
still
between
allowed.
40 and 60%. But this too would change with time. In 1996, Congress ruled that restaurants only had to pay tipped workers a minimum of $2.13 per hour, and that's
How the
still
fuck do you even live off that? $2 an hour, bruh? So you're making in a 8-hour day, you're making not even 20 bucks. Not even fucking $20. That's just
how it is across much
criminal,
of the
man.
US. You would think that
That's
with all
actually
these
egregious.
anti-service worker policies that people would rise up and protest these changes, but the exact opposite actually happened. You see, the demographics of service industries were rapidly changing. It was no longer a bunch of former slaves. In fact, over 50% of all waiters are now white people. But it wasn't just the public that was okay with the tipping either. Many service workers actually preferred the tipping model. You see, it wasn't just the race of service workers that was changing, it was also the age. Nowadays, service industries are filled with a bunch of high school students and young adults. In fact, nearly 50% of
sense.
all waiters are between the age of 20 and 30. For
Damn.
these people, doing service work is often a part-time thing, so stability isn't necessarily the top concern, meaning that they're much more willing to take a gamble. Instead of taking a set minimum wage, they're willing to bet on the generosity of people during a Friday night or Independence Day weekend.
Wait, there's no way that this is still like allowed for them to pay like $2? Really? There's no fucking
Statistically
shot.
speaking, you're much better off with a minimum wage, but this hasn't exactly changed the minds of service workers. Tipping was no longer about appreciation or fighting slavery. Tipping was now about maximizing revenue for service industries and service workers, leading us to where we are today.
The tipping.
It turns
bird,
out
huh?
that there's a whole science behind the psychology of tipping, and there's dozens of research articles about how to maximize tips. These studies found that waiters should introduce themselves, repeat customer orders, give compliments, call customers by their name, etc. But those are all small fish items. The factor that has really propagated modern tipping culture is none other than technology. The reality is that technology makes it so easy to spend money and has removed so much of the pain that is naturally associated with
Oh yeah, because you don't actually feel the $5 leaving your fucking pocket, huh?
spending
Or
money
$20, whatever the
that
fuck
we're
it is.
simply way more willing to spend money. Take cards, for example. Consumers are willing to spend up to 83% more when paying with a card as opposed to cash. So I don't think you'd be surprised
The
to hear
average
that the
American credit card debt is $6 grand. The average cash purchase is $22, while the average credit card purchase is $112. Well, yeah, I mean, especially for big purchases, a lot of people don't want to carry a bunch of fucking money around. It's not as safe. It's like there's a bunch of things that come with carrying a bunch of fucking money around. So it's obvious that like the big purchases would be with a fucking credit card. Like, come
the
on.
average cash purchase is only $22, while the average card purchase is $112. But by far the biggest culprit when it comes to excessive tipping is the infamous iPad payment terminals. For starters, you're paying with a card as opposed to cash, so that's already working against you. But there are several other factors that push you to tip. For example, you don't have to go through the hassle of calculating a tip.
Yeah,
You
it
can
shows
simply
the
select a
different
percentage and the iPad will
things.
do the math. Another technique that these terminals employ is suggesting a super high minimum tip. This terminal, for example, is suggesting a minimum tip of 18%.
Jesus.
Of course, you could skip the tip, but what if you felt that the service actually deserved a 5 or 10% tip? You can either type in the tip manually, which would just prolong the awkwardness, or you can just select 18. Speaking of awkwardness, this is likely the most effective method
Yo, we just watched this video yesterday. Let's go. That was epic.
when it comes
baby.
to guilting customers into tipping, and the source of most people's frustrations. Traditionally, any and all tips are left on the table, and waiters don't see the amount until after the customer leaves.
Yeah.
This allows customers to be honest about how good the service actually was. But when you're forced to select a tip amount at the register,
Right in front
you
of
know
them?
that the cashier is going to see what you select. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that everyone behind you is also going to see what you select, and you don't want to be that one person that skips the tip. Service industries have figured out how to brilliantly leverage technology and peer pressure you into maximizing tips. While this is a smart move for them, this has simply left customers exhausted and frustrated with modern tipping.
The anti-tipping
Hearing all this,
movement.
I don't think that you'd be surprised to hear that there's a strong and a growing movement against tipping. These people argue that tipping has nothing to do with showing appreciation and everything to do with the fact that many service workers aren't paid fairly to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like you tip service workers
They definitely aren't paid fairly to begin with.
who are paid well. For example, when was the last time you tipped your pilot or your lawyer or your accountant or your doctor?
Yo, Hawk, what's up, bro? How you doing, my man? Good to see you. Hopefully having a blessed motherfucking day like always.
These people provide way more valuable services than a waiter or a hotel housekeeper, yet you don't tip them. If anything, you might send them a thank you note or buy them chocolate. Why? Well, probably because you know that they're already paid well,
Yeah, their
which
salary's
supports the
already-
idea that the only reason you tip some service workers is because you know they're paid poorly, not actually because you appreciate their service. So, theoretically, if we paid
Me personally, whenever I tip, I have never thought, oh, this person's not getting paid a certain amount. Let me try to make up for a certain amount of percentage that they're not getting. I've never once ever thought about that one time. It's always been like, and normally I pay the same percent. You get the same percent whether you did great or you did shit. I don't care. You get the same percent no matter what. I keep it, you know what I'm saying? And I don't even do like a set percentage or anything. I just kind of do the math in my head and be like, oh, that's around 20%.
service workers better wages, we can eliminate tipping culture in America. Pro tippers don't agree. They feel that eliminating tipping will simply give businesses more opportunity to gouge prices. For example, a $21 meal may rise to $24. Also, this isn't all that favorable for takeout customers as they will also have to pay the higher prices. But with
I think I got good service. Wait, am I a Pepega? I can't understand that. Am I dumb? I think I'm dumb.
that being said, it looks like the rest of the world has made this work, so maybe there's something to it. But only time will tell. Are you team anti-tip or team pro-tip? Comment that.
I don't think we should make teams. Let's not make teams, bro. Why are we splitting everyone into teams? What do you mean? Are you team anti-tip or team pro-tip? Let's just fucking relax, bro. What do you mean? Why are we picking teams, bro? The fuck? The hell? Yeah, how about we just agree they should get paid more? Yeah, I know, right? Why can't we just come to that fucking conclusion?